Hi, storyteller. You know when you're reading a novel and you really get what it's trying to say? The theme resonates with you and hits the bullseye of your heart, and it just feels satisfying. And then other times you're reading and you're just like, stop hitting me over the head with your frigging theme, I get it already. One of the frequent culprits in this groan-inducing experience is that the theme comes on too strong. Sometimes the writer's having the characters pontificate in dialogue about what the story is about. It's as if they slip into being characters in a fable that state the moral outright. Or is that really a problem? I was rereading A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens recently, and was reminded just how thematically on the nose some of the dialogue was. Ebenezer Scrooge is very transparent about his dislike of Christmas as a waste of money. Let's take this exchange with his nephew Fred. It starts off with Fred telling Scrooge not to be grumpy, and Scrooge says, "What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? What's Christmas to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer?" And just in case you were thinking Dickens agrees with Scrooge, Dickens has this rebuttal from the nephew. "There are many things from which I might have derived good by which I have not profited. Though Christmas has never put a scrap of gold or silver into my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good." I've abridged this exchange, but you still get the gist. Scrooge is saying that Christmas is a waste of money, while Fred makes it clear that the benefits and goodness of the holiday cannot be measured in money. The point of the whole story is more or less laid bare right there in the opening pages. Very on the nose. Yet it still works. People like this story. When it was published in 1843, its first print sold out in under a week, and it has never been out of print. Not to mention it has been adapted across other mediums multiple times. The point I'd like to make with this is that it's entirely possible to create very theme-forward stories that don't have the readers begging you to stop bludgeoning them with your message. How is that done? Well, if you've watched any of my other videos, you know my answer is that it's done with a whole host of different skills and craft elements. Dickens deployed an entire arsenal of techniques in A Christmas Carol. But all things being equal, I'd like to highlight one specific technique that can really help set your story up for the gut punch rather than the eye roll, regardless of whether it wears its theme on its sleeve or is a bit more subtle. I call it the thematic choice framework, and I mainly developed it because a lot of writers I've encountered were struggling with weaving their theme into their story, with integrating it rather than adding it on top, so to speak, like some jarring heap of flour on a misshapen pancake. So today, let's talk about how to mix in this metaphorical flour so it doesn't taste like flour to your readers. In this video, I will cover what the thematic choice framework is and the 3 key points to keep in mind, how to use it to integrate the theme into your plot structure, character arcs, and how to use it if you're writing a story with multiple major characters. And finally, I'll give you tips to develop it for your own characters. I have discussed character motivation and theme creation in previous videos, and I do suggest you watch those to get the most out of this, although I will recap the main concepts as needed. Let's dig in. What is the thematic choice framework? If you've watched my video on why we tell stories, you'll remember that the driving force of a story is the difficult decisions characters make. We implicitly want to know how a character decides when faced with a trade-off choice, what price they pay, and whether it was worth it. That's kind of how we understand each other as humans and the social world that we live in. So in short, as readers, we are really interested in how characters decide. This is why successful themes are woven into consequential character choices, not necessarily into their dialogue. And in works where you do see them articulated in dialogue, that dialogue is part of a conflict where the characters are voicing disagreements with one another, like we just saw with Scrooge and his nephew Fred. And more importantly, the theme is then backed up by consequential choices, like again in A Christmas Carol. Stories that don't do this are the ones where we feel like we're being preached to, that are as appealing as raw flour. With that in mind, the thematic choice framework looks like a simple statement that is focused on choice and price. It goes like this. It is better to choose X over Y, even if it means losing Z. Here the X and Y are concepts or behaviors, and the Z is a concrete price that the character pays. For example, in a short story I recently wrote, the statement for my protagonist was, "It is better to choose freedom over safety, even if it means losing your home." Another example could read like, "It's better to choose integrity over success, even if it means losing social status." But there are three key points to keep in mind to get the thematic statement right. 1. The X and Y have to both be equally positive or equally negative. Going back to the example I gave, freedom and safety are both important and positive concepts. Integrity and success are also both positive. For an example of two negatives, we can say something like, "It's better to choose risking your own life over risking the lives of your loved ones, even if it means losing your future security." This would roughly be what a thematic choice statement for Katniss from the Hunger Games would read like. Here you can see that risking your own life and risking your loved ones' lives are both negative things. So again, make sure your X and Y are equally bad or equally good. The reason for this is that you want to ensure that you're setting yourself up for a trade-off decision. Again, I explained this in the storytelling video, but if you have to choose between one bad thing and one good thing, it's not really a choice worthy of a story. It's too simple and anyone would already know the answer. So make sure you set up a trade-off decision. 2. The Z is often a big goal or at least a representation of a goal that the character has been working toward throughout the story. So in the example from my own short story where it's better to choose freedom over safety even if it means losing your own home, my protagonist indeed spends the whole story trying to keep living in her home. It means a lot to her and she already went to great lengths to keep her home. But ultimately, when push came to shove, her autonomy and her freedom were more important to her than even her home. In the example of "it's better to choose integrity over success even if it means losing social status," you'd have to make sure you have a character who is striving for social status. The price has to be something uniquely meaningful to that character. And 3, this is not your character's belief. I covered beliefs and misbeliefs in a previous video. The character belief serves a slightly different function that is related to character motivation. This thematic choice framework, however, is what you as the writer want your reader to take away as a message. This is ultimately where a theme is embedded. One effective way to communicate it without beating the reader over the head with it is to mix it into the character choices. Before I move on to the next point, just to note that this specific framing, the whole "it's better to choose X over Y," is one that's used for non-tragic characters. So use this framing if you're writing a story with a happy or happy-ish ending. Chances are most of you are writing that type of story. So I'm not going to go into tragic characters here, but I do have a breakdown of their thematic choice framework on my website. I'll link it in the description below, and while you're down there, give me a like and subscribe if you're finding this explanation valuable at all. So now you know what a thematic choice framework is, but how do you use it to integrate the theme into your own story? There are several narrative elements this technique slots into, so I'll explain how to use it in terms of plot structure, character arcs, and also how to navigate multiple major characters with it. Let's start with using the thematic choice framework for plot structure. In short, the thematic choice statement lets you know what situations you have to get your characters into so that they are forced to choose between X or Y. For example, if the thematic choice statement is "it's better to choose integrity over success even if ... then I have to put that character into situations where they are forced to choose between integrity or success. Such as, she could be in a situation where if she lies, she'll get a promotion. If she tells the truth, she will not get the promotion. Integrity versus success. Now, every time this character is faced with a choice, it should be success versus integrity. You might worry that that would get really repetitive or constraining, but it's far from that. Let's consider A Christmas Carol again as an example. If you are not familiar with the story, I guess spoiler alert, but it's been out for over 180 years. The story is about an emotionally cold, antisocial miser who hoards money for the sake of hoarding it, and he gets visited by 3 ghosts who take him through his past, present, and future and change his entire personality in the process. By the end, he becomes a generous, gregarious guy who does good in the world through his money. At a quick glance, we could say that Scrooge's thematic choice is between human connection and wealth. Every consequential choice that he makes is between those two. We see him cruelly reject the men asking for a charitable donation. We see him choosing to let his fiancée go because he's chasing more wealth. And we see how his employee Bob Cratchit suffers because Scrooge won't even let him spend money on coal to stoke the fire in his office. And then at the end, we see him choosing human connection and the happy ending that creates. It doesn't get repetitive because the importance of those choices varies, like they're not all equally a big deal, and the context varies. This variation plus repetition is what's often called iteration, and iteration in narrative builds meaning. Simply put, when you're presenting to the reader a variety of instances where your protagonist is forced to make thematic choices, you are mixing in the theme and you're making it more palatable. Okay, Tina, I get that I have to illustrate my theme through character choices, but why does it always have to be between the same 2 choices? That's constraining. Glad you asked. Back to the Christmas Carol. Let's imagine that Dickens had veered off theme and forced Scrooge into a choice that was not between human connection and wealth. Let's say he had to choose between wealth and beauty, or human connection and freedom, or even altogether beauty and freedom. Even if it were just one scene, it would have fundamentally diluted the meaning of the story. And I mean this in both senses of the word. It would have confused the readers because they would have been wondering, what is this about now? And it would have compromised the emotional resonance of the story. A story has space for one thematic choice statement per major character. And if you don't abide by that, it's like you're telling your readers, I will serve you pancakes, and then you mix in some tuna into those pancakes. It's a violation of expectations and leaves a really bad taste. And that might cost you readers. And speaking of, how does the price of the thematic choice statement fit into plot structure? I just told you that your job is to force your characters into choice points where they're choosing between X and Y throughout the story. But do they also have to pay the price every time? Not necessarily. The Z in the thematic choice framework is specifically the price your character will pay in the final climax. This is the way you illustrate to your reader how important it is to choose X over Y, that even this price is worth paying. However, depending on the genre you're writing in and the arc of your character, your pre-climax scenes and decisions may or may not cost the character something. There's a lot that can be said about this, and I might make a future video about it. But for now, know that when using the thematic choice framework, the Z, the price aspect of it, refers to your final climax only. What about character arcs? How can you use this technique with those? Well, the thematic choice framework directs you to create situations that force your protagonist into a trade-off decision. But those situations don't dictate how your character will choose. So let's look at Scrooge again. His statement would start with, it's better to choose connection over wealth. The wealth is really a stand-in, but more on that later. Remember that this statement indicates to you what you want the reader to take away by the end of the story. So Scrooge has a positive change arc, which means he starts the story out by choosing wealth rather than connection. With the help of the ghosts, he reflects on the times that he made that decision, and by the end of the story, he's irrevocably choosing connection and spending his money to help connect with all the people in his society. For an example of a flat arc, let's look at Katniss from the Hunger Games. As said, her thematic choice is more or less, it's better to risk your own life over the lives of those you love, and we see her doing this repeatedly. She starts out risking her own life by volunteering as tribute so that her sister doesn't have to risk her life, and she ends the story by risking her own life rather than killing Peeta. The framework depicts the message, the theme that you want your readers to take away. How your character gets to it is a matter of their arc. If you're writing a negative arc character, I suggest using the tragic framework that is discussed on my website but is beyond the scope of this video. Alright, this is straightforward enough, but what if you have multiple major characters that you want to develop equally in depth? Do they all have to have the same thematic choice framework? The answer is no, they should actually not have the same thematic choice framework. In fact, if they do, then either make one a minor character or cut them all together, because otherwise they're fulfilling the same function and therefore being repetitive. In my previous video on writing theme, I've explained the theme question and its purpose. As a recap, the theme question is the overarching question that your story is exploring, and every major character answers it in a different way. I do strongly suggest you watch that video, as this is a pretty extensive topic, but I'll give you an example to try to make this more concrete. Let's say I'm writing a book with one overarching theme question of how do you find somewhere to belong? And let's say I have a protagonist and a second major character. The protagonist's thematic choice statement is it is better to choose integrity over success, even if it means losing social status. And let's say I'm going to give her a positive change arc. So I, as the writer, want to tell the reader that no success is worth it if it costs you your integrity. My job at that point is to tell a story where I'm having the character striving to succeed to climb a social ladder because she firmly believes that she'll find a sense of belonging there. But then, over the course of the story, she learned that all the lying and cheating she's been doing to achieve her success is destroying her relationship with her one true friend in the world, and she'll realize it's not worth it. At the climax, she chooses to maintain her integrity, even though it will cost her all the status that she has gained. But at least now she knows what it feels like to belong. The other major character is the one who will become her friend. His thematic choice statement is, it's better to express your needs over pleasing others, even if it means losing connection. And I'm going to give him a flat arc. So that means I, as the writer, want to tell the reader that you should prioritize your needs, even if that will shrink your friend circle. My job at that point is to tell the story of this guy who is an outcast, but he really doesn't want to fundamentally change himself to fit in. Instead, he wants to find his people. Over the course of the story, he becomes closer friends with the protagonist and thinks he's found that elusive sense of belonging, until she asks him to neglect his needs so he more neatly fits into her big plans that she's been pursuing all this time. Although he's been helping her up until now, when faced with this demand, he refuses and the friendship is destroyed. He's sad, but feels good about his decision. And then, when she comes back and apologizes and tells him she'd rather have his friendship than high social status, he and the reader know that his choice was the right one. So as you can see, the thematic choice framework helps you explore the overarching theme question by letting your characters provide different answers to it. Note though that having a theme question is only relevant if your story is expansive enough to have more than one major character. If you're writing a short story, just use the thematic choice framework for your protagonist. Even in the case of A Christmas Carol, which is a novella and so quite short, Scrooge is pretty much the only major character. Maybe if we try real hard, we could ascribe a thematic choice framework to his nephew Fred and maybe his ex-fiancée, but the scope of the story can fit into just the thematic choice framework. And it doesn't necessarily need a theme question. As always, choose the tools that you need for the scope of your project. Which brings me to my final point. How do you use this technique in your story? Well, as mentioned, readers are very drawn to characters making difficult decisions. And the thematic choice framework is your anchor that helps you articulate to yourself what it is you're trying to say to the reader through the character choice. But wait, what if you yourself don't really know what you're trying to say? Don't worry, you're not alone. Very few of us come at a story through the theme, but the thematic choice framework can actually help with that too. As soon as you have an idea for a story climax, you can develop the thematic choice. Chances are you know the genre of your story and roughly where it's heading. You probably know if a key point of no return will include smooching or spying, a penitent confession, or a pancake competition. So take one of your climaxes and determine what two equally weighted concepts your protagonist is choosing between. Here are 2 tips to keep in mind. 1. The Z, which is the price, has to be a concrete external outcome, with very few metaphysical exceptions like losing your soul or losing yourself. The price that the character pays should be something tangible. In other words, it should not be just a bad feeling or potential for a bad feeling or potential future trouble. And 2, the choice needs to be behaviorally actionable, meaning they can't be states of being like be rich, or they can't rely on others like be appreciated. The key is that you can use these concepts to build character action from them. And if you're thinking now, but wait, you said Scrooge is choosing between connection and wealth. How is wealth different from being rich? Good catch. I did also say that it was a stand-in. Let me walk you through how I would more accurately create Scrooge's thematic choice statement. Like said, I would start with the climax. Looking at it, it's tempting to say Scrooge chooses generosity at the climax, but it's more personal than that. He finally accepts his nephew's Christmas dinner invitation, and that has nothing to do with money. And in Scrooge's backstory, we have witnessed the points of rejection and loss and desire for connection in his life. So I would still say that the statement starts with, it's better to choose human connection. Or maybe I'd say vulnerability, one or the other. For the second choice, it has to be a concept that is equally positive to connection or vulnerability. I had said wealth previously because even if you're vaguely familiar with the story, it's a true statement on the surface. However, money in fiction doesn't tend to be a good in and of itself. It usually represents something else. And in Scrooge's case, I feel his desire for wealth represents emotional safety. He doesn't do anything with his money, doesn't even buy himself comforts. His ex-fiancée says to him right before she leaves him, "You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach." So she's saying he's after riches because he's scared of the world. This indicates Scrooge is using wealth as a protection against the harm that the world could do to him, like the harms that he has suffered in his youth. So this is why I'm thinking emotional safety as his choice. He just believes that money will provide that emotional safety. So what about the Z, the price he has to pay? Note that the price that your character pays depends on the genre. In more grim genres, it can be worse than death itself, and in more lighthearted genres, it can be small and temporary. For example, in a cozy fantasy, a protagonist's house might burn down because of the thematic choice they made, but in the resolution, the house might get rebuilt. A Christmas Carol is a pretty light story, so all Scrooge loses is some of his money. But given how money-focused he used to be, this is still a meaningful price that he has to pay. So I would say a working thematic statement for Scrooge would be, it is better to choose connection over emotional safety, even if it means losing money. This is roughly how I would go about figuring out the statement for my own characters. It's a process of interrogation, checking, and tweaking. When you're creating these for your own characters, getting it completely right is much less important than getting it down and being consistent. If in your initial discovery phases you're noticing that your character is consistently veering off course of what you had put down as the statement, reassess the statement. It's intended to be a guide tool, and part of its guidance is to help give you a little bit more distance from your characters, to figure out whether they're really serving the pancakes that your readers are expecting. My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.